There is an ancient insight repeated across civilizations that reality is not divided the way it appears to be. What seems separate is, in truth, deeply connected. The world outside us and the world within us are not opposing realms, but reflections of one continuous intelligence expressing itself in different forms. To understand the universe, one must first understand the inner landscape, where perception, thought, and meaning are born. Long before modern science attempted to map the brain, ancient traditions described the mind as a structured cosmos, layered, ordered, and governed by invisible laws. These traditions did not view consciousness as a random byproduct of matter, but as a fundamental organizing principle that shapes experience from the inside out. What we now call psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral science were once explored through myth, ritual, and symbol, not as superstition, but as precise tools for navigating the inner world. At the center of this understanding lies a simple but unsettling idea. The human mind is not chaotic, it is engineered. Every thought, emotion, and belief arises from a hidden framework, an internal architecture that determines how reality is interpreted and acted upon. We do not encounter the world directly. We encounter a filtered version of it, shaped by memory, expectation, and unconscious patterning. This inner structure acts like a lens, bending experience before it reaches awareness. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient philosophers intuited. The brain is composed of layered systems, each operating at different speeds and depths. Beneath conscious thought lies a vast automatic network responsible for survival, habit formation, emotional response, and prediction. This system is efficient, fast, and largely invisible to awareness. Conscious thought, by contrast, is slow, limited, and often arrives after decisions have already been made. In other words, the sense of being fully in control is largely an illusion. The mind tells stories to explain actions it did not initiate. It constructs narratives to maintain coherence and identity. This storytelling function, what neuroscientists associate with the brain's default mode network, is not designed to reveal truth, but to preserve continuity. It protects the image of the self, even at the cost of accuracy. Ancient mystery schools understood this long ago. They taught that the untrained mind is reactive, fragmented, and easily influenced. Without awareness, a person becomes a product of internal forces they do not recognize and external forces they do not question. Rituals, symbols, and initiations were not arbitrary traditions. They were methods for reorganizing the inner structure of perception. This is where power enters the equation. Whoever understands the architecture of the mind gains the ability to shape belief, behavior, and identity. This knowledge has always been closely guarded, not because it is mystical, but because it is effective. Religion, ideology, advertising, and political systems all rely on the same mechanisms: repetition, emotional charge, symbolic imagery, and narrative framing. These elements bypass conscious reasoning and install patterns directly into the subconscious. Belief is not adopted through logic alone. It is built structurally. Once a belief is embedded deeply enough, it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like reality itself. This is why challenging certain ideas can provoke fear, anger, or identity crisis. To threaten a belief is to threaten the internal architecture that holds the self together. Philosophers of antiquity described the human being as a miniature universe, a self-contained world governed by the same principles that shape the cosmos. To know oneself, they argued, was not a psychological exercise, but a cosmological one. The patterns that govern stars, cycles, and natural order also govern thought, emotion, and intention. Modern science has begun to observe similar patterns. fractal geometry reveals that nature repeats itself across scales. The same mathematical structures appear in galaxies, weather systems, neural networks, and blood vessels. Complexity arises not from randomness, but from simple rules repeating themselves endlessly. The brain follows this same logic. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. Thoughts that are revisited become defaults. Emotions that are frequently activated shape perception. Over time, the inner landscape becomes familiar, predictable, and self-reinforcing. This is why change feels difficult, not because it is impossible, but because it requires restructuring deeply ingrained pathways. What we call habits are not merely behaviors. They are physical expressions of internal order. A disciplined inner world tends to produce structured routines, stable health, and long-term focus. A fragmented inner world often manifests as inconsistency, exhaustion, and impulsive behavior. The body becomes a visible map of the mind's condition. Energy levels, posture, sleep patterns, and even breathing reflect the internal state long before conscious awareness catches up. This is not moral judgment, it is correspondence. Small, repeated actions accumulate into large-scale outcomes. A single choice means little in isolation, but over time it becomes a pattern. Patterns become identity. Identity shapes destiny. What appears sudden from the outside is almost always the result of invisible repetition on the inside. Ancient alchemical traditions describe transformation not as sudden enlightenment, but as gradual refinement. The raw material of the self, fear, desire, confusion, was not to be rejected but understood and reorganized. True change occurred through integration, not denial. Modern psychology echoes this insight. Suppressed emotions do not disappear, they re-emerge as symptoms. Unexamined beliefs continue to influence behavior. Awareness alone does not dissolve patterns, but it creates the possibility of choice. Where awareness enters, rigidity begins to loosen. This is why introspection has always been central to spiritual practice, not as self-obsession, but as recalibration. Meditation, contemplation, and ritual slow the mind enough to reveal its structure. They expose the automatic processes normally hidden beneath constant stimulation. When the inner architecture becomes visible, it becomes negotiable. At this point, responsibility emerges. To understand how the mind works is to recognize one's role in shaping experience. This does not mean controlling reality through force of will. It means aligning intention, belief, and action so that they no longer contradict each other. When inner conflict decreases, external friction often follows. The illusion of separation between mind and body, self and world, thought and matter begins to dissolve. What remains is a sense of participation in a larger process. Life is no longer something that happens to the individual, but something that moves through them. The purpose of inner work, then, is not escape from the material world, but conscious engagement with it. Meaning is not found by rejecting daily life, but by inhabiting it with clarity. Every choice becomes an expression of inner order. Every action reinforces a pattern or rewrites one. This is the hidden architecture of the mind. It is not mystical in the sense of being unknowable. It is mystical in the sense of being unseen. And like all structures that operate in silence, it shapes everything while demanding very little attention, until it is understood. When awareness meets structure, transformation becomes possible, not as a sudden miracle, but as a steady reorganization of perception, behavior, and identity. The inner world begins to reflect coherence, and the outer world responds in kind. Not because the universe is being controlled, but because it is being mirrored. What takes shape within us does not remain there. It echoes outward subtly and persistently, shaping experience over time. To change the reflection, one must work with the source. And that source has always been closer than we think.